808.14 hours. The air smells of pine, frost, and distant panic. For the men of Sonderkommandoberger, this patch of frozen Ukrainian mud was supposed to be a backwater, a quiet sector to run their tests. Their vehicle, designated VK4502P AOSFB, sat under a camouflage net, looking more like an engineer's mistake than a weapon of war. It was a beast of gleaming red primer and mismatched plates. Its turret, a monstrous curved slab of steel designed by Krupp, mounted impossibly far to the rear of the chassis. It was unbalanced, underpowered, and prone to catching fire. It was, by every metric of the Heereswaffenamt, the Army Weapons Office, a categorical failure. The crew knew it. The mechanics huddled in the half-destroyed ISPA knew it. And history knew it, as Henschel's Tiger II design had already won the contract. This tank, this thing, was destined for the scrapyard. The ground trembled, not from the low, familiar rumble of their own panzers, but from the high RPM scream of Soviet V2 diesel engines. Lots of them. A frantic voice crackled over the field telephone, the line heavy with static and terror. Durchgebrochen. Sie sind durch. Sektor Caesar ist gefallen. Breakthrough. They were through. Sektor Caesar had fallen. A reconnaissance battalion, probing the German line, had found a seam, a gap between two overstretched Volksgrenadier divisions. And now they were pouring into the rear, aiming straight for the supply dumps and command posts. Aiming straight for them. The sounds of 76mm guns cracked through the woods, followed by the dull thump of impacting high explosive. A column of smoke, oily and black, rose from where the field kitchen was supposed to be. Oberleutnant Kessel, the engineer assigned to oversee the prototype's trials, dropped the handset. His face was pale. He wasn't a tanker. He was a designer, a man of slide rules and blueprints. His crew of 3 were factory technicians, not combat veterans. They weren't even issued a full complement of armor-piercing rounds. Their ammunition was mostly concrete-filled practice shells for calibrating the experimental 80 Kilomdaste 43 Dawes L71 gun. But in the ammo locker, nestled beside the inert rounds, were 5 live Panzergranate 39 43 shells. 5, kept against all regulations, just in case. Kessel looked at his driver, a man named Hanke, who was already staring at the prototype's ignition panel. There was no order. There was no support. The retreating infantry were streaming past their position, faces grey with terror, rifles clutched in frozen hands. They didn't even glance at the strange tank, writing it off as just another piece of battlefield detritus. Another explosion, closer this time, rained frozen dirt onto the tarpaulin. Kessel nodded. Just once. Hanke! Starten! Start it! Hanke's fingers flicked across the dash. With a whine of electric motors and a guttural coughing roar, the twin Porsche air-cooled engines caught fire. The sound was wrong. It didn't rumble like a Maybach. It shrieked. The failed prototype lurched, its tracks biting into the ice, and turned its monstrous rear-mounted turret towards the sound of the guns. The story of this impossible tank began not in the snows of Ukraine, but 2 years earlier, in the humming design offices of Dr. Ferdinand Porsche. In 1942, the Waffenamt had issued an urgent call for a new heavy tank, one capable of mounting the devastating 88mm KWK-43 and dominating the new generation of Soviet armor. The competition was fierce, pitting the brilliant, unorthodox Porsche against the reliable, conventional Henschel firm. Porsche, a favorite of the Führer, proposed a radical solution. Instead of a traditional mechanical transmission, his design, the VK45.01P, would use a complex petrol-electric drive. 2 air-cooled V10 engines would act as generators, producing electricity to power 2 massive electric motors, one for each track. In theory, it offered infinitely variable steering and smooth acceleration. In practice, it was a maintenance nightmare, prone to overheating, and consumed vast quantities of copper, a resource Germany could no longer spare. Henschel won. Their design became the formidable Tiger the Count, Tietz, the Königsteiger. Porsche was left with a factory line that had already produced nearly 100 chassis for his failed bid. Most were famously converted into the Ferdinand tank destroyer, a turretless behemoth. But a few chassis were held back. They became guinea pigs for the next generation of design. The vehicle now rumbling to life under Oberleutnant Kessel's command was the pinnacle of this failed lineage. The VK45502P Osan B. It was one of perhaps only 3 prototypes ever completed. Its most jarring feature was the Heckturm, the rear-mounted turret. This configuration was an attempt to simplify production and to better accommodate the enormous overhang of the new long-barreled 88mm gun. But by placing the turret at the very back, it created severe balance problems and put the engines, the prototype's most vulnerable component, smack in the middle of the hull, directly under any potential penetrating hit to the fighting compartment. This specific Versuchskommando had been sent to the quietest sector of the crumbling Eastern Front in the winter of 1944. Their mission was simple: drive the tank until it broke, fix it, and drive it again. They were to record engine temperatures, test the torsion bar suspension over rough terrain, and fire the gun at distant, static targets. They were engineers and factory hands disguised as soldiers, operating miles behind what was, until an hour ago, a stable front line. The broader context was one of total collapse. The Red Army, having shattered Army Group Center, was now executing its deep battle doctrine. Fast, mechanized columns bypassed strongpoints, punching holes in the brittle German lines, held by exhausted veterans and poorly trained Volksgrenadier, and racing for the soft rear areas. The noise Kessel's crew heard was not a preparatory bombardment. It was the sound of a Soviet Tank Corps reconnaissance battalion that had found one such hole. They were rampaging, destroying supply dumps, headquarters, and airfields. And Sonderkommando Berger's test ground was, by pure terrible coincidence, sitting directly on the crossroads that battalion needed to secure. The VK4502P was never meant to fight. It was a rolling laboratory, and its crew were scientists, not soldiers. As the tank crashed through the thin camouflage netting, the reality of their situation slammed into them harder than a solid shot. The crew compartment was cramped, filled with exposed wiring harnesses, diagnostic gauges, and chalk marks from the engineers. The gunner, a man named Strauss, was an optics technician from Leitz. He had never fired the 88mm gun in anger. The loader, Bauer, was a welder from Krupp, his hands built for assembling hulls, not slamming 50-pound shells into a breech. Oberleutnant Kessel himself was a transmission specialist. He knew every bolt and relay in the complex electric drive, but he knew nothing of small unit tactics. Hanke, the driver, was the only one with any real experience, having tested Panzer IVs, but even he was unnerved by the prototype's bizarre handling. The petrol-electric system gave it no feel, no mechanical feedback, just a low, electric whine and a disconcerting, unnatural smoothness. The first T-3476 burst from the tree line, 900 meters away. It was moving fast, its green hull caked in mud, a white star stark against the grime. It fired on the move. The shot was wild, a streak of orange tracer that hissed past the turret and exploded in the forest behind them. The sound lag, the shell arriving before the crack of the gun, disoriented them. "Target, front! 900!" Kessel yelled, his voice tight. Strauss mashed his face into the optic, his hands clumsy on the traverse wheels. I see him! Traversing!" The electric traverse whirred, but the turret's position was the core of the problem. To aim forward, the massive gun and mantle had to swing 180 degrees, passing directly over the louvered engine deck. It was a slow, vulnerable maneuver. The T-34, seeing this strange, high-profile target, skidded to a halt and fired again. This time, the shot hit. The 76mm shell slammed into the heavily sloped 150mm frontal plate. The impact was apocalyptic. Inside the hull, it sounded as if the world had been struck by a blacksmith's hammer. A shower of white-hot spall, tiny flecks of a paint and metal, shotgun through the compartment. Hanke screamed as a piece seared his cheek. The tank shuddered, but the armor held. "Bauer! AP! Load! AP!" Kessel roared, tasting burnt metal. Bauer fumbled with the locking clamps, his hands shaking. He pulled out one of the 5 precious Panzergranate 39-43 rounds. He heaved the shell, ramming it home and slamming the breech. "Waffe geladen!" Gun loaded. But as Strauss brought the crosshairs onto the T-34, two more green shapes emerged from the fog on its flank. A reconnaissance platoon. The first T-34 was already moving, darting for cover. "Fire!" Kessel ordered. Strauss punched the trigger. The 80 mm turret gun exploded, a deafening concussion that filled the compartment with acrid smoke. The prototype rocked violently on its suspension. The shot was clean, a flash of light that impacted the dirt mound in front of the T-34. The long L-71 gun, designed for extreme range, had a very flat trajectory. Strauss, accustomed to static range calculations, had failed to properly lead his moving target. "Short! Reload! Reload!" Hanke, meanwhile, was fighting the vehicle. "I can't maneuver, Herr Leutnant. The port motor is sluggish. It's overheating." A red warning light on his diagnostic panel began to flash. The revolutionary electric drive was already failing under the strain of combat maneuvers. They were a stationary target, their gun unproven, their armor attracting more fire, and their one-of-a-kind engine actively trying to die. The flashing red light on Hanke's diagnostic panel was a death sentence. The portside electric motor, its copper windings never designed for the sudden, high amperage demands of combat, was failing. They were losing mobility. The turret was still facing the wrong way. The T-34s were closing, fanning out to flank them. This was the exact failure scenario Porsche's rivals at Henschel had predicted. A complex, delicate machine, dying under its first moment of stress. Kessel watched the T-34s maneuvering, their 76mm guns spitting fire. They were trying to get at the prototype's thinner side armor. And then Kessel, the engineer, not the commander, saw it. He didn't see a tactical problem. He saw a design problem. And he saw a design solution. The tank's greatest, most mocked flaw was its Heckturm, the rear-mounted turret. To fire forward, the gun had to traverse 180 degrees. But to fire backward, it was already in perfect position. "Hanke!" Kessel shouted over the ringing in his ears. "Reverse! Rückwärts! Schnell!" The driver stared at him, his face a mask of confusion. "Retreat? Nein, Hanke! Not retreat! Fight in reverse! Put the front armor toward the trees and drive away from them!" Hanke was a factory driver. He had tested the Porsche electric drive for hundreds of hours. He knew its greatest secret. Unlike a mechanical transmission, the petrol-electric system was symmetrical. It could go just as fast in reverse as it could forward, with the same smooth torque. His hands flew across the controls. He disengaged the forward clutch and slammed the heavy reverse lever. The electric motors, fed by the roaring V10 generators, screamed in protest, and then obeyed. With a lurch that threw the crew against their stations, the 68-ton prototype surged backward. Suddenly, the tactical situation was inverted. The T-34s, which had been racing to get behind the strange new tank, now found themselves facing its gun. The prototype, meanwhile, was presenting its thickest, 150mm sloped frontal plate while retreating. It was the ultimate defensive posture, an accidental masterpiece of engineering. "Was Strauss!" Kessel yelled. "Target, the lead T-34, range 850. The gunner, no longer needing to traverse the turret across the entire engine deck, made a fine adjustment. The crosshairs settled. "Bauer, load, second shell." Kessel glanced at the overheating light. "Hanke, cut power to the port motor. Reroute all available electricity to the starboard drive and the turret traverse." It was a desperate gamble. They would be slower, steering with only one track, but the traverse would be fast, and the starboard motor wouldn't melt. Hanke's hands flicked a series of breakers, plunging the left side of the dash into darkness. The tank shuddered, but stabilized. Another 76mm shell impacted the front plate. It was a deafening, bone-jarring blow, but it skittered off the angled steel. "Loaded!" Bauer roared. The lead T-34, its commander likely baffled by the tank that was running away, and shooting at him simultaneously, turned to give chase. It was a fatal mistake. "Target acquired," Strauss yelled, his voice now steady. He had him. "Fire!" Kessel commanded. The 80mm gun fired for the second time. The recoil was absorbed by the tank's backward momentum. The shell, a Panzergranat 39-43, left the barrel at over 1,000 meters per second. It didn't just hit the T-34. It eviscerated it. The shell punched through the driver's plate, tore through the fighting compartment, and detonated the ammunition rack. The T-34's turret was blasted 20 feet into the air in a column of fire and black smoke. The explosion of the T-34 lit the clearing with a ghastly momentary flash, followed by a profound, concussive whoomph. Inside the prototype, the crew was stunned. They had done it. The machine worked. He's gone, Strauss whispered, his eye still pressed to the smoking optic. Bauer, load! Kessel's voice was sharp, cutting through the shock. There are 2 more! The remaining T-34s, seeing their leader vaporized by a tank that was apparently fleeing, hesitated. It was a fatal 2-second pause. Hanke, now understanding his role, kept the reverse lever jammed. The single overloaded starboard motor shrieked, a high-pitched electric wail as it dragged the 68-ton chassis backward over the frozen ground. Hanke used the dead port track as a pivot, skid-steering the behemoth, slewing the entire hull to face the next target while maintaining their backward momentum. The 2 T-34s split. It was the correct tactic. One raced for the prototype's right flank, while the other tried to circle wide to the left, hoping to get a shot at the weaker side hull or the vulnerable engine deck. Engage the right, Kessel ordered. Strauss, 700 meters. The tank on the right was closer, a more immediate threat. It fired on the move, its 76mm shell a red tracer that skipped off the snow and slammed into the prototype's thick lower glacis plate. The impact rang like a church bell, jarring the crew, but the armor, designed to defeat guns far larger than this, held contemptuously. Loaded! Bauer roared, slamming the breech on their third AP shell. Target! Strauss yelled, his hands flying across the traverse and elevation wheels. The rear-mounted turret gave him a perfect, unobstructed field of fire. Fire! The 80mm cannon barked again. The shot was a masterpiece. Strauss, now confident, laid the crosshairs on the T-34's turret ring. The shell hit with the precision of a sniper, a flash of white-hot metal. It didn't detonate the ammunition. It jammed the turret solid and shattered the traverse mechanism. Smoke billowed from the impact point. The T-34, its gun now locked uselessly forward, swerved violently and slid into a snowbank, its crew bailing out of the hatches, disappearing into the woods. 2 down. But the third T-34 had used that time well. It had reached their 9 o'clock, a position from which it could fire at their side. Hanke! Hard left! Swing the hull! Swing it! Kessel screamed. Hanke tried. He fed all power to the starboard motor, trying to pivot the massive chassis. The tank groaned, the motor's whine rising to a hysterical scream. And then a circuit breaker snapped with a loud crack. The starboard motor died. They were dead in the water. A 68-ton steel coffin, its revolutionary drive system completely inert. The final T-34 emerged from the trees 600 meters away, turning its hull for a broadside shot. It stopped, taking careful aim. Bauer! Load! 4th shell! Kessel said, his voice now strangely calm. This was it. The generators were still running, but the drive was gone. Strauss, you have 1 shot. Make it count. The turret, its traverse still powered by the generators, swung slowly to the left. The T-34 fired first. The shell struck the 80mm side armor. It was a clean penetration. The shot tore through the empty space where the port side motor used to be, shattering its housing, and exploded against the internal bulkhead. The compartment filled with smoke and the smell of burning oil. But the crew was untouched. The strange, inefficient layout had saved them. Loaded! Bauer coughed. I see him, Strauss yelled, his optics filling with the image of the T-34. Fire! The 88mm gun fired its 4th shell. It hit the T-34 dead center, punching through the glacis plate. For a second, nothing. Then, a bright orange flame licked from the driver's hatch, followed by a catastrophic internal explosion. The battle was over. The silence that followed the third explosion was absolute. Heavier and more suffocating than the armor plate surrounding them. For a long moment, the only sound inside the tank was the frantic, high-pitched whine of the ventilation fans, trying to pull the acrid cordite smoke, and the stench of burnt oil from the compartment. Bauer, the welder, was slumped against the bulkhead, his arms limp and trembling from the sheer exertion of heaving the 50-pound shells. Hanke, His face smeared with grease, and the blood from his spall-nicked cheek was still frantically throwing levers and resetting breakers, his breath fogging in the frigid air. It's no good, Herr Leutnant," he finally whispered, his voice cracking. "She's dead. The generators are running, but the drive motors, both of them, they're fused. We are a steel box. We can't move." Kessel pushed open the heavy commander's hatch, letting a rush of icy air cut through the smog. He slowly, cautiously raised his head. The forest clearing was a vision of hell. 3 Soviet T-34s were burning, each a funeral pyre, sending a thick column of black smoke into the pale winter sky. The snow around them was churned and blackened. Of the rest of the Soviet column, there was no sign. The sounds of engines and gunfire were now distant, receding. The armored probe, likely a reconnaissance in force, had been bloodied, its lead platoon annihilated by an unknown variable. They had hit a rock, and the rock had hit back. The crossroads, for now, was secure. Sonderkommando Berger, the engineering team, had held the line. He dropped back inside, his mind, the engineer's mind, processing the data. The VK4502-P was a technical disaster. Its revolutionary drive system, the very thing that was supposed to give it an edge, had catastrophically failed under its first real-world stress test. It was immobile, a 68-ton paperweight, and yet it was a tactical masterpiece. The 150mm frontal armor had proven impenetrable to the 76mm guns. The 80mm KWK-L71 had performed flawlessly, destroying 3 tanks with 4 shots. And its most absurd, most criticized flaw, the Heckturm, had, when combined with the symmetrical electric drive, created an entirely new and utterly effective defensive doctrine: the high-speed reverse engagement. "Bauer," Kessel asked, his voice hoarse. "Ammunition status." Bauer did a quick count, his hand still shaking. 1, Herr Leutnant. 1 Panzergranate left. The rest are concrete. They had defeated a tank platoon with 4 live shells and a broken engine. An hour later, the first German soldiers appeared. They weren't from a panzer division. They were a weary, gray-faced squad of Volksgrenadiers, led by a grizzled Feldwebel. They crept from the trees, their rifles leveled, staring in disbelief at the monstrous, unknown tank sitting silently amidst the burning Soviet armor. The sergeant, his eyes wide, climbed onto the hull and looked down at Kessel. "In God's name, what is this thing? We thought you were the Russians." Kessel pulled himself out of the hatch and sat on the turret, the steel still warm. He looked at the dead T-34s, then at his crippled prototype. "It's a failure," Kessel said, the irony tasting like ash. "The drive system is completely destroyed." The sergeant stared at the wrecks, then back at Kessel, and let out a short, harsh laugh. "A failure? Herr Leutnant, if this is a failure, I'll take a dozen." The VK45.02, P, Ausf B, never moved from that clearing under its own power. Its revolutionary, and ultimately fatal, drive system was a mass of fused copper and melted steel. When the Volksgrenadier counterattack failed to materialize, and the rumble of Soviet armor returned, this time in force, Oberleutnant Kessel and his crew knew their mission was over. They were engineers to the last. They carefully removed the experimental gun sight, gathered their diagnostic notes, and placed their remaining demolition charges on the engine deck and in the breech of the magnificent 88mm gun. They lit the fuses and vanished into the woods, just minutes before the first T-34s of the main assault force cautiously rolled past the still-burning wrecks of their comrades. The prototype, having performed its one and only act of war, was consumed by a white-hot chemical fire, its secrets erased by its own creators. In the grand, sweeping narrative of the Second World War, this event does not exist. It is a ghost. No official combat report mentions the Sonderkommando Berger. The VK4502, P, is remembered, if at all, as one of Ferdinand Porsche's most spectacular failures, a paper panzer, a quirky footnote in the development of the King Tiger. Its petrol-electric drive was deemed a technological dead end, too complex, too demanding of resources, and too fragile for the brutal realities of the Eastern Front. Its rear-mounted turret, was written off as a bizarre and impractical design choice. The Henschel design, the Tiger II, was the winner. It was the tank that went into production, the one that made history. But history is written by the victors. And in that small clearing, for one desperate hour, the victors were 4 factory men in a tank that shouldn't have worked. Kessel, Hanke, Strauss, and Bauer were not soldiers. They were technicians who, when tested, proved to be warriors. Their true breakthrough was not mechanical, it was intellectual. Kessel, the transmission engineer, was the only man alive who could have looked at that tank's greatest, most crippling flaw and seen it as a winning tactic. He didn't use the tank as it was designed to be used. He used it as it could be used. This is the forgotten legacy, that innovation is often just desperation in a different light. The story of the VK 4502 P is a testament to the idea that no machine is truly a failure. It is merely a tool, waiting for the right hands and the right moment to achieve the impossible. If this story of ingenuity and courage moved you, hit like and subscribe, because history like this, the history written in grease, sweat, and fire, deserves to be remembered.